My name is Shirley Rodriguez. I'm a project coordinator at the Public Health Institute of Western Mass. And I work on one of our initiatives is the Springfield Healthy Homes Collaborative. The Springfield Healthy Homes Collaborative is a citywide collaboration of community partners and stakeholders from multiple sectors who have joined together to begin to address the health issues faced by residents due to poor housing conditions. The key health concerns related to housing include asthma, elderly falls, and lead paint poisoning. And today we're so happy to have with us Dave Turcott. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dave so he can present himself and take it away.
I'm a research professor at UMass Lowell, and I direct the Healthy Homes program and Healthy Homes Training Center. And I've actually done many in-person workshops over the last several years out in Western Massachusetts and Springfield and Holyoke. And so I look forward to working with everyone today and over the next additional 3 webinars. And I've been doing trainings for the National Center for Healthy Housing for the past 9 years. And many of the slides that I'm presenting today and the subsequent 3 meetings are taken from larger 2 and 3 day trainings. So I look forward to presenting to you today and hearing your questions. And I know we got a diverse group of people. So I know we're gonna set up a poll just so we have a good idea of what kind of occupations and positions people are in. So if you could please respond to the poll and then we'll present the results before we begin.
All right, Dave, so the poll is up and people are currently responding.
Yeah, I see it.
Oh, that's good. All right, Dave, would you like me to go ahead and
Yeah, why don't you do that? So it looks like mostly healthcare and housing, which is normally the majority of the folks who attend these seminars. So that's great that we have such a diverse group of folks in other areas also. So before I begin the presentation, we're actually gonna, sorry to kind of weigh you out with polling early on, but we're gonna put up another poll now just to see what types of health impacts and problems you've seen in the home for those who have been able to go in the home and visit folks as part of their work. could end the poll, I think.
Okay.
So, I think a lot of folks work with folks with asthma, maybe because that seems to be the largest, factor that people have seen. So health issues. So we're going to spend a lot of time today, as well as in the other webinars, talking about asthma and addressing some of the things in the environment that could worsen it. And certainly there's falls, something that happens among children and older adults and then high lead blood is obviously a concern for young children. And with the older housing we have in Massachusetts, it's a common issue. So thank you for sharing with us this information. Now, one of the things we're going to get into is talking about some of the hazards that actually contribute to this. So we're going to ask you, it's going to be a question in the chat room, and if you could just, quickly just list one particular hazard, that has contributed to these major health problems that you've encountered in your work. That would be great. And then after that, we're going to get into the presentation.
So again, the question that's in the chat is, what are the housing conditions that cause these health impacts or problems?
Well, this is quite a list of hazards that we're finding here that people are listing in the chat. And we're going to spend, today talking about these hazards, as well as the next 3 webinars, and talking about strategies and to address them. So glad to hear that people have experience, at least in dealing and seeing some of these hazards. So they're familiar with many of the ones you can find within homes within this region. So I'm going to begin with the presentation right now. I appreciate everyone providing this feedback. So today we're going to do an overview of healthy housing principles, and one principle afterwards called Keep It Dry. We're going to be introducing several principles over the next 4 webinars. And as I mentioned earlier, the slides that I'm presenting here are part of larger trainings from the National Healthy Homes Training Center that's supported by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So for those in the health area, you're probably familiar with Florence Nightingale. She did a lot of work in the late 1800s, advocating for improving the health of workers and their living conditions. And she clearly recognized at the time the connection between the health of individuals and the dwelling that they lived in. And not everyone is, as vulnerable as others. Children in particular are vulnerable to hazards in the home, physical, chemical, biological hazards, even psychological impacts can cause harm to children. And one of the factors here is that children spend a lot of time in the home, particularly now since the pandemic. They're spending more time in the home. And it has cost a lot of money in the economy and in the United States, trying to address and dealing with the ramifications of various hazards, lead poisoning being, very high, close to 51 billion, various neurological behavioral disorders that are related to the home environment, asthma, as well as childhood cancer. For those who aren't familiar with asthma, I know many of you are, it can be serious, people do die every year, unfortunately, from asthma. It affects millions of people in the United States. And there's no cure for asthma. And really, you need to, the best way to control it is either medication and managing the environmental triggers. And that's what we're going to focus on today and in the other webinars, is really on addressing the environmental triggers. So housing has been a problem in the United States. Every 2 years, the federal government does a American Housing Survey, and you can see how things have changed since 2007.
Thank you, Jen.
That those severe physical problems found in housing have decreased somewhat over the last few years. The types of housing that have moderate physical problems have increased in number. And this was a report that was issued by the Institute of Medicine, which is an authoritative body that looks at existing medical and scientific evidence. And when they issued their report 20 years ago or so, they had said that there's various hazards or issues in the home that could be affecting asthma. So on the left-hand column, these are things that actually could lead to the development of asthma, that when someone doesn't have asthma. On the right-hand columns, it talks about exacerbation of asthma, which means triggering asthma attacks, worsening asthma conditions. So I just want you to focus kind of on the top two rows here. So it was clear that house dust mites you cannot see, can actually contribute to asthma being developed in individuals that don't have it. But it certainly, can trigger an asthma attack, as well as cats and cockroaches and exposure to environmental tobacco smoke, which is ETS. And it's really, the connection is really strong, as a causal agent, and the evidence is very strong. On the next row down, which indicates sufficient evidence of an association. This evidence is strong that if you're exposed to it, you could lead to the development of, let's say, asthma if you're exposed to environmental tobacco smoke if you're a young child. And on the right-hand column, some of these hazards, if you could worsen your asthma condition, but the evidence of it actually causing the trigger is not quite as strong as in the upper row. A few years later, the Institute of Medicine also looked at, the exposure of dampness and by itself, damp environments as well as mold went in a damp environment. And you can see the evidence of an association is very strong, which means that as you're exposed to these exposures, you're going to, likely increase these symptoms. And if you look at the furthest right-hand side, when you bring in mold to dampness in space, damp space, then you also basically develop asthma symptoms, meaning you worsen asthma conditions. And since then, there's been some other studies that have even shown other associations. So it's clear now that the evidence is strong, showing that, exposure to rats can worsen asthma conditions, and exposure to mice can worsen asthma conditions, as well as can also be an important contributor to actually causing asthma in someone. Then in another report that was issued by the World Health Organization based on, again, new research, and this shows that a lot of the evidence that was released by the Institute of Medicine is still solid, like asthma exacerbation, nothing's changed there, but there's more sufficient evidence now when you're exposed to dampness and mold that could actually lead to the development of asthma. And then, the evidence is also very sufficient now in regards to it causing respiratory infections and exacerbating current asthma, as well as causing shortness of breath. So even if you don't have asthma, it could actually also contribute to issues of breathing. So this is kind of local data. I know Springfield has the reputation of being, kind of the #1 city in the United States. But this is some data that I received from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, the asthma office. And right now they're showing that Holyoke, based on the most recent data that they have available, is actually higher than Springfield. Lowell, where I live, is high too, but not quite as high as Springfield and Holyoke. But from the standpoint of the statewide average, all of these cities and most cities in Massachusetts have much higher asthma rates than the general population across the state of Massachusetts. So folks living in communities like Holyoke and Springfield are more vulnerable because of that. So when we talk about kind of how do you address these issues, we feel that the most effective way is taking an integrative approach, which takes into consideration that the people, who are here living in the home, the individuals, the structure of the home, as well as the type of potential health hazards that they may have that make them more vulnerable to the exposure. So in addition to that, there's a lot of interconnectedness between these hazards. So this will kind of show you some of that. So basically, you see if you're exposed to moisture and water intrusion into the home, it leads to mold development, which can lead to asthma exacerbation. And then the moisture and water intrusion also leads to structural damage, which contributes to pest problems, deterioration of the paint, which then leads to lead poisoning. And deterioration of structure can also lead to injuries as well as fire because of the pest problems. And then because you have pests, then pesticides will get introduced into the home environment, and the pest will exacerbate asthma. But the pesticides are also not healthy for children to be exposed to. They can ingest it, by touching it on their hands, or they can by eating it, and that can make them sick. So all of these things are interconnected, and that's why it's very important to be taking a holistic approach when we're talking about this and trying to address it. So the first principle that we're going to introduce is keep it dry. And at this point, I wanted to have Shirley introduce another poll, which just will ask you to kind of identify the most common types of moisture sources or leaks that you have seen during home visits. And this will be the last poll of the day, so just wanted to let you know that. We're going to end the poll in a few seconds, so the last chance to vote. So, roof leaks are, the most common that people have seen, and it certainly is a very common issue, as well as plumbing leaks and some of the others here that are listed, like condensation on the surfaces. And we'll be talking about that today. Thank you for giving us this feedback. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the key principle of keeping it dry. These are a set of principles that were developed by the National Center for Healthy Housing. And we feel, if you kind of follow these principles, because these principles are interrelated, it's a holistic approach. When you do think about these principles and try to implement them and follow them, and we believe, based on experience and science, that this is a very effective approach to addressing in-home hazards. So when we talk about healthy housing, we're talking about, housing that's designed, constructed, maintained, and rehabilitated in a manner that's conducive to good occupant health. So obviously, unfortunately, based on past experience, we know that all housing hasn't been, designed, construction, maintained, and rehabbed with this in mind. I mean, putting lead paint into homes, obviously, it didn't take into consideration, the conducive health of the occupants and so forth. Now, we may not have known everything when lead paint first started to be used, but during the course of, more information and more knowledge becoming common, it took a while before lead paint was removed from paint being used within the residential environment. So when we think about, addressing these, there's a lot of real world factors that come into play here. We know the world is complex, and, we try to kind of function based on current knowledge. But as I mentioned, originally when lead was put in paint, it probably wasn't known that it may have negative health consequences, particularly to children. It did become known later. And unfortunately, it was still used and sold even after it's started to become known. There can be economic factors in here, which we'll be talking about is, often certain types of materials are used in construction of housing or in rehab, or certain kinds of items are used in the maintenance of housing, and often the driving force on what gets selected is economic. And it may be something that's less expensive, may not be healthy for the occupant, but it's selected because it's economical. Obviously, too, social and cultural backgrounds of individuals who live in housing are varied, and that can contribute to the complexities involved in trying to address these issues. There may be political and legal factors that exist that contribute to it. But our approach is, to err on the side of caution and to try to ensure that, we're not making decisions and we're not doing things that will cause harm to occupants. And there are, existing laws out there, as you're probably well aware of. There's various laws that impact the rights and responsibilities of tenants and landlords. Usually, housing has to have an occupancy permit in order to be occupied. There is a duty for tenants to pay rent, but tenants have the right to withhold rent if there's violations in the housing code that exist, or use that money to make their own repairs, and they are protected by retaliation from landlords, and evictions and enforcement are governed by housing laws in Massachusetts and other places. So, when you're working with folks, obviously the existing laws are going to contribute to how you're able to address issues, what you're able to address, and what are more challenging to address. So the federal government, every 10 years comes up with kind of objectives that they would like to achieve. These are the objectives that the federal government are trying to achieve, Healthy People 2020 objectives. So there's several aspects of these objectives that relate to the home and hazards within the home. So one objective is to lower the blood levels of children lower pesticide exposure to occupants, lower the number of allergens, the level of allergens within housing, increase the amount of homes that have radon mitigation systems, which we'll be discussing later on in another webinar, increasing the single-family homes that have radon reducing features, as well as decreasing lead-based paint and lead-related hazards in the home, and decreasing the number of units out there that have moderate or severe physical problems. So, as was indicated in the polls, based on people's experience and based on what the Institute of Medicine talked about, if you're exposed to mold and moisture, these are the kind of health consequences that individuals could be experiencing. And then the last one, we're talking about the development of pneumonia and certainly exacerbation of asthma and potential development of asthma by just being exposed to mold and dampness and moisture. So one key aspect to think about is, does the water drain away from your home? Obviously, in this case, it wasn't draining very well. But there's a lot of sources of moisture that can get into a home. If the rainwater and groundwater is poorly managed, it's likely there's going to be intrusion, plumbing leaks, as was mentioned by folks, and condensation is a common problem on the surfaces of home, as well as construction moisture, coming up from the soil or during the process of construction. So these are common, the most common interior leaks that were noted in the 2015 American Housing Survey. So, leaking pipes is the most common, other kinds of leaky fixtures, and so forth. When we're talking about exterior, roof, which was mentioned, I know in the poll, as a common exposure issue. But you can also have, see a lot of leaking in the basement and on walls and so forth. And then this kind of indicates that 19% of the homes had more than one exterior problem. So these are the common exterior problems, foundation cracks, holes, broken windows, roofing material, and other outside material missing are the more common. Some issues with holes and sagging roofs, which obviously if you get a hole or a sagging roof, you're likely to have leaking, water intrusion within the homes. So this diagram kind of creates, different scenarios, contributors to how water gets into buildings. So here you got, it's raining out and you don't have good landscaping outside of the home. So instead of directing water away from the home, the water's running back into the home and it's leaking into the basement and so forth. Then if you got leaks on the roof or other places, that's another way water enters the building. But there's a lot of activities, that we do that, bring water into the home, from cooking and bathing and watering plants, breathing, washing, water vapor. Water vapor can also come in, from the soil. There can be groundwater coming up underneath the home that can get into the home. This is showing you again, just another example of this. And where it points out that flashing and gutters are important. We're going to be talking about this over the next few minutes, but if the gutters aren't working or they're not directing water away from the from the structure, then you can have water intrusion. And again, it's the importance of ensuring that the water is moved away and that the high point is against the foundation in the home and it directs water down away from the home, unlike what's happening here where you're getting water, kind of flowing from the hill, down the hill towards the home. And then, as you can see here, when people and animals breathe, they there's vapor that gets into the environment from plants, also from cooking and showering. So all these things contribute to, moisture coming into the home. Here's an example of something that needs to be repaired on the left. There's two problems with this. One is it's crushed and it's going to prevent water from coming down the downspout, when it collects the rainwater off of the roof. So you're probably going to have water spilling over the gutters going down the side of the home. If the picture on the right shows you kind of what it should look like, it should basically extend out and move the water away from the home. And on this picture on the top left is showing you what happens when windows are installed incorrectly, where they don't have good flashing. The lower photo shows you how it should be done. But what you had in the upper left-hand column, upper left-hand photo is you had water seeping down from the outside below the window into the walls, basically led to deterioration and mold, and it's a big disaster. So it's one thing to keep in mind, because unfortunately window leaks do contribute to water getting into the homes. And then here's another photo of another problem because of a bad installation, was installing the air conditioner in the wall. So the problem with that is that the air conditioner creates kind of condensation on the coils, and that over time, that condensation started to lead to dripping of water and basically led to structural damage and mold growth in the apartment below that unit. And then porous materials, all the foundations are very porous, so water can enter through the foundation. It can wick up from the outside along the concrete walls. And here's again showing you kind of a problem that developed because the ground was sloping towards the house as opposed to away from the house. And again, that led to water coming into the home and led to structural damage and mold growth, in a basement apartment. And the upper left-hand photo is showing you what you would like to see in a basement apartment. If you have good design and you're moving the water away from the building, you're not going to have water intrusion. If you have a basement apartment, it's recommended that you have some kind of dehumidifier to remove humidity from the environment, which tends to be damper in the basement apartments in anyways, because they're built right on the ground or in the ground. And so this is, the upper left-hand photo is a well-maintained basement apartment versus what happened in this other photo. And there's something called the moisture meter that you can use that you can help detect what the source of the leak might be if you're getting some leaking in the walls and so forth. So that's what this person is doing here, trying to identify, where the leak might be. If there's a pipe behind that wall and there was a leak, then that would be a likely problem that might be causing it. There could be a leak on the pipe within the wall. Most homes around here, as you probably know, based on your experience, have basements, but some do have crawl spaces. And what this is showing you is really an ugly crawl space that you would never want to enter. But some of the common hazards that you would run into in spaces would be, mold, pests, pesticides, asbestos, lead paint, lead in the soil, dust in the soil, sewer gases, radon, which we'll be talking about later in another webinar. And so this is not a nice place you would want to be exposed to, but the problem is you have a floor above it. And if you get all of these contaminants underneath the floor, and if you have any kind of, the HVAC system running through the crawl space, which does happen, you could be pulling in contaminants into the home as the air is moved through the system. So this is a better designed crawl space. Everything's well sealed and clean. And so it's not going to be any hazards in there that would, have any impact on the residents living above it. This is another problem that I actually have seen in a condo building in Chelmsford, which is a town that borders Lowell. This was a townhouse that was on a slab, didn't have a basement, didn't have a crawl space. It was just on concrete slab, and they basically put the heating vents and the AC vents inside under the slab, basically. And so you had a lot of water draining and moving under the slab, and you had a lot of dirt getting into the vents, the piping that was run under the slab. And I actually looked down the vent and I could see dirt that the vent pipe had been broken open, and that soil from under the slab had basically washed in to it. So it's not the kind of recommended situation as part of a design that you would certainly encourage. So this is something, to keep an eye out. It's not that common, but it does exist. The other thing is you want to make sure, there's a way of draining water in the basement if possible. But you got to make sure that, the drain is working and unclogged. And again, you really want to have a working humidifier in any kind of a basement, because they are generally damp environments. And if you don't have dehumidifier, luckily you're going to have mold growth. So if you happen to have water coming into the basement, it's critical that you drain it as soon as possible, that any kind of paper or wooden materials should not come in contact with the foundation floor. You should elevate them on shelving if you're going to have them in the basement. You want to keep warm, humid air away from the earth surfaces where it's cool, because that's going to lead to condensation, which will likely lead to mold growth, particularly if you've done some kind of remodeling or renovations in the basement. And you definitely want to have a dehumidifier. So if you have water intrusion into your basement and you have a refinished basement, you really need to dry that basement out in those materials within 24 hours, maximum 48, or you're going to have mold growth for sure. This is plumbing issue. You want to be able to keep an eye out on plumbing problems, because you could have small leaks that over time lead to the development of mold. This is again under the sinks, likely places where, the piping is being connected to the sinks is where, at those connections are where you likely would have some kind of leaking happen. This is under the refrigerator. You can also get leaky refrigerated drip pans that could cause mold to grow within the home. And again, this is kind of showing you on a per pound basis of moisture per day where most of it usually comes from. So as you can see, the bulk of it is often through the foundation, the dampness in the foundation, but all the typical activities in the home of washing, bathing, plants, cooking, respiration, breathing, contributes a lot of moisture in the home. The bottom of a toilet tank, a lot of times you can get condensation there, and that could be a source of mold being developed. These are for air conditioning coils. You got to keep them clean, because you do get condensation, and condensation on the dust will help lead to mold growth, and that's what's happened here. And this is mold that has developed on the walls. And what happens is, as you can see in the left-hand picture here, it says that because of poor insulation, you get condensation. Why would you get condensation and mold growth because of poor insulation. The reason is that if you have moisture in the environment, and moisture is going to go like a magnet to the coldest surface. And so if there's no insulation and this is the winter and you have some kind of vinyl wallpaper there, condensation is just going to accumulate where there's no insulation because that's the coldest surface, and that's where you're going to get mold developing. And if you ever sat outside on a hot summer day with a drink full of ice, you see all the moisture and condensation on the outside of the glass. That's because on a hot, humid day, you got a lot of moisture in the air and it goes right to the cold surface. And that's what happens in the home too, unfortunately. This is showing you the pipe is very straight here. And what you're showing here is that above here, you have another pipe and you're getting condensation on the pipes in a straight line. And so it's developing mold. And that's what you're seeing in this picture that's being circled by the yellow line. So, you need to identify what the source of the mold is, because if you have mold, you can clean it up. But if you don't address the source of what's contributing to the mold growth, you're going to continuing to have it over and over again. So you got to make sure everything's dry. And if it's a design problem, then you have to fix it so that it's not going to be reoccurring. Anything, like I said, that gets wet and it's still going to be in a damp environment, you got to discard because it's likely to continue to grow. And it's important, to take these steps. And there's different ways of cleaning up mold. This is showing you on the left, it was an area that was cleaned with a good HEPA vacuum. On the right is kind of the mold, what it used to look like. Is, someone actually using a good HEPA vacuum to vacuum up some of the mold. But, if you're going to do any kind of cleaning of mold, if it's a small area of 10 square feet, you could do it yourself. Usually detergent and hot water is enough to clean up most mold. It's not too big. And, you want to, use a rag or something to do it. You don't want to use high pressure spray because that could just throw the mold spores around the environment and create a bigger hazard. But you want to take precautions. You want to, put on a mask. You want to have eye protection. You want to wear gloves and the coveralls and so forth. And you want to be able to, not contaminate the rest of the environment by having mold spores on your clothing. That's why it's important to, remove any kind of contamination and put it into bags and so forth. If you had a real serious job, you'd have to have a outside contractor that specializes in this. And just like you would see with lead paint abatement, if you got a serious mold infestation, you got to seal the area while you're removing the mold, so it doesn't, the spores are not going to be spread around the home. So the key messages from the webinar is, excess moisture creates a lot of conditions that can have negative health consequences, and moisture in the home can come from internal sources or outside sources. And again, you should prevent, excess moisture from getting in by, appropriate methods, construction methods, making sure you have a good working plumbing system that doesn't leak, and you have good temperature controls and environment, and good ventilation can help keep the moisture down too, which we'll be talking about later in the webinars. And maintaining things. You got to maintain things to ensure that you're not getting excess moisture into the home. So at this point, I've concluded the presentation, so it's open to questions. If you have any questions, you can submit them in the chat room, into the chat space.
There's a question, is if there's mold on the ceilings or walls, could somebody paint over it, or would the mold continue to grow even after it's covered?
Yeah, well, again, you get what's causing the mold. So if you don't address the cause of the mold, then it's going to continue. So if you paint over mold, chances are the paint's going to peel quickly. It's not going to, stay on as quickly as it would if you were, painting a clean surface. But the key is you got to find out what's causing the mold, why is it growing in the first place, and then take steps to make sure it doesn't happen again, or it's going to be reoccurring. You can have new mold growing too. So my recommendation would be find out the source, and also don't paint over mold, clean it, then paint over it.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Here's another question. What does black mold mean in the bathroom?
What does it mean? Well, it means you got excess moisture. So you need to determine why and take some steps to reduce the moisture. I mean, it could be that you need an exhaust fan, that when people take showers, there's just so much moisture and it just grows on the walls. And, and you either can't open the window or opening the window isn't adequate. So you may need some kind of exhaust ventilation. It may be a leak from the outside causing it. So you really got to identify what the source of the excess moisture is.
What are landlord responsibilities when rental unit has this problem?
Which problem? The mold in the bathroom?
I believe.
Or any problem. Yeah, well, again, the landlord, I mean, the code requires if the landlord has to maintain the structure. There shouldn't be leaking pipes. There shouldn't be holes in the roof, leaks from the roof. There shouldn't be leaks from the, walls or around the windows. So if there's leaking, like that happening, then that, needs to be fixed, If the landlord doesn't want to do it, then, there's a local inspectional services or health department that is required to enforce the sanitary code, and they would be required to come in and inspect if you filed a complaint, and then they would probably cite the landlord to fix the plumbing leak, or will fix whatever the issue is. It's it's contributing to the problem. Now, that doesn't mean every landlord is responsive, because I know that's not the case, but they are technically responsible to take action. I should qualify that is that you could be creating the mold problem by your own actions, which means that if you were using like a humidifier and putting excess moisture into the air, and that may contribute to mold growing, but it's really not the landlord's problem because, nothing's leaking. There's no physical structural issue that's contributing to it. It's your own behavior that's contributing to the mold from being developed. So that would be a case where the landlord really isn't responsible. You would need to not use a humidifier and generate so much humidity and moisture into the environment. We recommend that you keep your relative humidity at 50% or less. That will ensure that you won't have mold generally. And if your activity is just contributing it to it, then you would need to get a dehumidifier, which again would be your responsibility in general, not the landlord's.
Great. I don't see any other questions.
Okay, well, we still have 4 minutes, so we can wait and see if anyone wants to think of anything. Or, I mean, as I mentioned, a lot of this material is taken from at least a 2-day training. So I've compacted a lot of information into this webinar. So I apologize if I've overwhelmed people with too much information, but I'm trying to show people pictures, and show people issues that can have negative consequences, and talk about some of these.
Yeah, definitely.
It can be complicated, but.
All right, so as we wait for any more questions to roll in, if you'd like to register for those other webinars in the series that Dave mentioned, I'll go ahead and share that registration link in the chat. And that's where you can see the other 3 webinar series that will be held for the next 3 Thursdays at this same time from 3 to 4 p.m. And also a certificate of attendance is available upon request after completion of the webinar series. If you're interested in a certificate of attendance, please feel free to email me, and I'm going to add that, type that in right into the chat. It's srodriguez@publichealthwm.org. Dave, we just got a question in here. Can you expand on the pneumonias described as a symptom in an early slide?
Oh, yeah. So what we were talking about was that if you're exposed to dampness as well as mold, it could lead to the development of pneumonia, among individuals that are sensitized to it. So that's what I believe you're referring to. So again, you don't want to, living in an environment that's damp and has mold is not healthy, and it can lead to the development of pneumonia in some people. Well, I hope this was, helpful, and I do look forward to next Thursday's webinar, which will be focusing on, keeping it pest-free and keeping it clean, which again are interconnected. That's why we take holistic approaches, and it's important to keep all these principles in mind to ensure a healthy environment.
Yes, thank you, Dave.
Okay, well, thank you.
And I hope to see you guys next week.
As well, do I.